Welcome to Geek Warning, the podcast that puts the world's most interesting cycling tech and more into one place. I'm Suvi Loponen, and joining me for the first episode of Geek Warning for 2025 are Dave Rome.
Hello.
Ronan McLaughlin.
Hiya.
And Alex Hunt.
Hello.
And Brad Copeland will also be in the show later on in the Ask a Wrench section, so you'll still hear his voice as well.
Yeah, so I mean, for those that missed our last episode of 2024, the award show, Brad has announced that he's joining Specialized Factory Off-Road Racing as the head mechanic, and because of that, he's stepping back and still being the mechanic on this show, but won't be talking about all the latest tech because he's contracted to a single brand now. So anyway, you'll hear Brad shortly.
And before we get into today's show, I just wanted to also say that if you're an Escape member, then thank you very much for your support. We have started to add Escape ads into a free podcast like this one, but as a member, you won't hear them. And if you're not a member yet, then you will hear them. And I do hope they'll inspire you to become a member soon.
Oh, hi. Dave Rome here. If you're hearing this, then you're on the free feed of the Escape Collective Podcast Network. We're happy you're here, and we'll continue to give plenty of expert opinion and analysis away for free. But really, our best stuff is saved for members of Escape Collective. After all, with no advertising or affiliate links, it's our members who make this all possible. From in-depth interviews with leading experts, to class-leading reviews, through to unique things like my Threaded series for anyone spinning spanners of any level. That's the sort of content you'll get by becoming a member. And as an added bonus, you won't have to listen to ads like this again. Head to escapecollective.com/join to sign up.
We're going to kick off today with some news from the industry. We're kind of going to go back into last year because it was a bumpy end of the year for quite a few brands, quite big brands, mostly in the mountain bike sphere of things. Rocky Mountain and GT were probably the biggest names that we heard from, and both had quite troublesome 2024 and announced some changes. They both, I think, announced that they said that they're still going to sell bikes, but not necessarily in the same capacity.
Yeah, quite different stories. So, I mean, GT is under the PON Holding banner, so that for those aren't familiar, like PON is a pretty massive conglomerate that owns Cervelo, Santa Cruz, Cannondale, and the list goes on from there. And yeah, GT is one of those brands, and they've basically announced that they had been building up to a full relaunch of the brand, a full restructure. They'd hired a lot of people, had been really working to relaunch that brand, and basically PON has seemingly pulled the funding from underneath and has laid off a large majority of the staff and has decided to maybe not close the brand forever, but for now, while the market's in a downturn, not relaunch the brand. So they'll still be offering aftermarket support and I guess selling the stock that remains, but that's basically the famous GT bikes done for the time being. Yeah, and we covered this at the end of the year, but yeah, the biggest, I guess the news broke through a lot of the athletes finding out that they no longer had a job with GT, which is some pretty big news. So
yeah, and then that was, I think, only a few days, if not, was there even a week between the two of them, that Rocky Mountain on the Canadian side filed for similar to, what is it called again? 11
chapter. Kind of a equivalent of chapter, like Canada's equivalent of Chapter 11 bankruptcy. So it's like a restructuring bankruptcy. So goals to continue trading, but basically under almost government control to get them back on the rails.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's definitely sad to see for me. I remember GT was one of the brands that I used to go into a local bike shop and lust after when I was first getting into mountain biking. In fact, one of the first bikes I remember seeing in the garage was my dad's Avalanche. So to see that brand suffer as it has, it's really sad to see.
Yeah, it really is. And I think, most people that have been in cycling for, say, more than a decade probably have a story or a memory related to GT. And it is a properly historic brand. And but at the same time, you look at it in the current market, and you kind of do question like, is it needed? It's a hard one, and there's a lot of love for that brand, but there's a lot of choice right now. And from Pond's point of view, I mean, where does it fit in?
Yeah. Well, Ronan, do you have any connection to Brompton?
I do. I once raced a Brompton for 10 grand in a winner takes all, and I took nothing. I took a whole chunk out of my bank account going to London to compete in a race that I didn't win. But other than that, yeah. It was an elimination race.
The win were you?
I think I was third. It was an elimination race on the track, and there was like you had to unfold the Brompton.
Oh, yeah.
Run Le Mans style start. Run to your Brompton, unfold it, get on the bike and race, and then it was an elimination race or devil take the hindmost or whatever you want to call it.
So I've actually seen some of these Brompton races, and people are very, very dialed with unfolding their Brompton. I'd liken it to kind of like Rubik's Cubes competitions. Like we're talking like maybe 10, 15 seconds kind of thing. How rehearsed were you on this, Ryan?
I was working for Sustrans at the time, who I think are one of the biggest Brompton customers there is. We all used to ride Bromptons everywhere. It was like your work bike or your company car, so to speak, was a Brompton. And so I was well used to it. And part of the qualifying process was, yes, unfolding. I can't remember if it was folding or unfolding a Brompton. And I'm just trying to find my time now, and I think it was like 8 seconds or something.
It's quite good.
Is that
going.
on Strava?
With a heart rate included in the activity.
But yeah, I qualified in the top 10 with my fold anyway, put it that way.
Okay. All right. So you weren't losing too much. You weren't losing time there.
No.
How optimized was your setup?
It was very strict on what you could and couldn't use. But I found a few hacks that I'm not sure if I should divulge them here now or not. I'm not sure if they were cheating or not. But yeah, altering the standard jersey that we were given, and very considered number placement, and I think we were allowed proper shoes.
Was the chain waxed?
The chain was not waxed. It wasn't my Brompton, so the chain was not waxed.
Okay.
Well, we're going to move on from this side tangent while Ronan looks for the time, because the reason we brought up Brompton is that Brompton hasn't had a very great start to the year. They reported their pre-tax profit to be only £4,602 for the last year, and this is down from £10.7 million British pounds in the previous year. So yeah, a huge decline in their profits. Their sales did not necessarily decrease as much. It was only 5% in there. But yeah, they obviously had more costs this year, in the past year, than previously.
Is there any insight into what those costs were? Like, were they investing in stores or in new production or anything like that? Like, they had a few new models. Like,
Yeah, they said, I think, operating expenses, 15% increase, higher staffing and marketing costs, which obviously the marketing costs would have been because of those new product launches. And they did say that the sales of the new higher end models continued to be really strong, but just the overall sales just were not that great.
I do wonder how the G line that came out last year, I do wonder how that performed, because I'm just not sure it quite hit the mark for a lot of people when it comes to what a Brompton represents. Yeah.
Not been a great start for the year for Brompton, and I think their CEO was one to say that 2025 is not going to be too rosy for the industry. Can't necessarily say that it's going to be overall the whole industry, but he certainly wasn't that convinced after these results.
Yeah, I think that's a general sentiment, is that it's, at the start of last year, even 2023, we heard from a few brands that were perhaps overly optimistic that 2024 is the year that we bounce back, and I just don't think we saw that in 2024. We saw a number of brands close, like Kona had its issues, Orange, the iconic UK mountain bike brand, had its issues and was basically bought back by some employees. Pole, another mountain bike brand, like a niche mountain bike brand, went bankrupt. They've since launched that they've going to come back as well under the original owner. Basically, they managed to buy back the IP. But yeah, I think there's a lot of doom and gloom from last year, and we closed out the year that way, and it's feeling like that's going to continue on for a little while.
I do wonder, actually, Dave, following on from that, if brands like Brompton that are kind of built around more the commuter space, if they're still just feeling the effects that have carried on since the pandemic. Less people are traveling into offices, so the demand for that kind of stuff just isn't where it was 5 or more years ago now.
Yeah, I think so, and I also think Brompton's like, it's kind of a luxury purchase in a way, like it is a premium product, and I think there's also that people just aren't quite spending as much. Like from what I've seen, a lot of retail sectors are still down as far as demand and sales. So unfortunately, I think cycling's not unique to any of that.
Yeah, but then it's their higher end models that are selling better. So yeah, I guess they sell fewer models, but the more expensive ones, which
and I mean that's the people that can afford the high end bikes are not feeling the pinch as much as those that can't. So I think we're also seeing that the same story in the road world, where say Colnago is going strength to strength at the moment, but perhaps the price point down are seeing the pinch. So yeah, it's I guess it's not hugely surprising that Brompton is still seeing demand for their top end stuff, but I guess it's their bread and butter, which is probably where they've seen the decline. I don't have insight into that, but that is a blatant assumption.
Yeah.
9.5 seconds to build it, to assemble it.
Not even. Just you would fold it back.
Squatter. No, actually, yeah, you must. I think you had to build it.
I think
and then
you have to do
fold
both.
it down again. Yeah. I can't remember. I should really be able to remember that, but yeah. Anyway, moving on.
Yeah. So Ronan, like I guess it's not just bike brands that are suffering. I mean, like component and clothing brands. We're seeing some signs there, and there is sort of a well-known clothing brand that has closed its doors. What's going on here?
Yeah, I'd say relatively well-known. La Passione, I think it's pronounced. They've closed the doors, as you said. And I don't think this one's all too surprising. The website had been pretty bare for a long time. Everything was on sale. And then rumors were circulating. And I'd actually mentioned the brand in that piece I did back in like September about how much it actually cost to sponsor the World Tour clothing. And they had sponsored Movistar just a couple of years ago, and now seem to be another brand who very soon after supplying a World Tour team are no longer with us.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, anyway, I think I'm going to go out on a limb and say that these closures aren't the last we'll see. I think there's more to come, and dare I say in some cases it might be the industry sort of resetting itself, because there's a lot of choice at the moment, and I don't think the cycling market is as big as the number of brands that we have. So times are tough, but good luck to everyone in there.
Another trend that is probably going to be, not going anywhere, is the selling of companies to bigger companies. What do you call them? Investors.
Acquisitions.
The consolidation of brands, I would say.
Exactly. Yeah, everything getting together. Because it was just this week, Revelist, who is the parent company of Giro, Bell, Fox Racing, was sold to strategic value partners.
Yeah. Which is the most sounding finance firm of all finance firms. But yeah, so Revelist was basically created as an offshoot by Vista Outdoors, and Vista Outdoors being the parent company that owns a huge number of brands. I mean, Giro, Bell, Blackburn. They'd acquired Fox Racing, which is a pretty significant brand. They also had Camelback. They had Bushnell Golf, a lot of brands, but they also have significant investments in firearms and ammunition. And there was, quite a few years ago, quite a public boycott of the sports brands based on their link to funding, products used in war and all that. So I think it was a reaction to that they created Revelist to split off all the sports brands, and basically by doing that they've managed to sell that entire division. So yeah, it's new ownership, but it'll be interesting to see how they do. I mean, that's a pretty extensive list of brands, and I guess I'm kind of keen to see the likes of Giro get new investment put in, and see some new products come out of them.
Mm-hmm. And it was quite a high number deal. It was US dollars, $1.1 billion, the sale. So yeah, a huge amount of cash thrown there. Moving on to something a little bit more positive from all this doom and gloom that we have opened this episode with.
What a way to start the year.
Yeah. Well, it will only get better from here. So yeah, keep optimistic. Well, on a more positive note, we have some developments, some positive developments to report on as well from SRAM. Or I don't know if it's positive really, but it's developments.
Yeah, I mean, positive if you like new potentially proprietary components. So yeah, I mean, this is something I think back in 2021 we'd seen a patent application from SRAM for what was effectively like a universal brake mount. So if you can imagine the universal derailleur hanger that just about every mountain bike frame has adopted, kind of the same story, but as a brake mount that mounts off the axle, and then there's sort of like a secondary bolt that can be placed somewhere on the frame. And yeah, they've been awarded that patent so quite recently, and I guess this is interesting because as we saw with the UDH, people are like, oh, isn't this nice? SRAM are being so generous and fixing the derailleur hanger issue of there being hundreds of different derailleurs, and they're going to give us this out of charity. They're going to give us this nice universal derailleur hanger so we can walk in any bike shop and get a derailleur hanger for our bike. And then as everyone found out, it was like the Trojan horse of the bike world, and it was actually designed to create a standardized fitment for them to create their transmission derailleurs, their T-type derailleurs, and mount a derailleur directly to the frame. And I think, SRAM won't be able to sneak this one past us again in that. So I think it's pretty clear that the goal with them doing such a integrated design is to eventually integrate a component to it. So yeah, the basic idea is that it's a brake mount that mounts off the axle, and yeah, users would create a universal mounting system, and then yeah, that secondary bolt could mount to say the chainstay of the frame, or potentially the seat stay as well. And currently the patent drawings show it as like a post mount system, so it would just basically create a new mount that you then attach an existing mountain bike brake to. But for me, I see this as going the same way as UDH, that it could have implications for road, it could have implications for gravel, it could be a true universal system that would allow any kind of brake or any kind of brake to be adapted to it. And long term, I could really see them integrating calipers straight into this mount.
Exciting.
Yeah.
Dave, with the hanger, with the UDH beforehand, with hangers in general, like that's an easy one to get. Hangers broke. Yep. Every frame had a different hanger. That was an issue. UDH solved, made it easier.
Yeah.
What's the upside for the end user with this?
I think that somewhat remains to be seen, but for me, I mean, we're seeing a lot of tolerance and alignment issues is one factor with brake mounts. Like it's pretty common for shops to need to face brake mounts now, and I think that is one option, is that if you're creating a brake mount that goes directly off the axle, in theory it's kind of going to be closer to being self-aligning to the axle, which is the whole point of facing a brake mount. So I think it potentially solves an issue there. I think it could also just be lighter as well if you're integrating the brake mount to the axle with the brake caliper. I think there's weight savings, there's perhaps other clever things they can do to reduce vibration and potential noise that's caused from vibration. And I think it potentially is cheaper for the frame manufacturers. I think, if you look at most frames at the moment that are using post mount, they have these pretty wild little posts sticking out from the frame, and on an aluminium frame, that's more weld points or more things to machine. On a carbon frame, it's perhaps difficulty in the molding process, which they then have to like put threads into. And I think this would just allow a frame manufacturer to basically just create a hole and then bolt apart too. So I think there are benefits there on both sides, but I think the whole benefit is probably yet to be realized, and we're probably 5 years out from seeing SRAM's reasoning behind it.
You think that long? 5 years?
I think it'll take 3-ish years for frame manufacturers to adopt it widely enough for SRAM to then bother to show us why they're asking frame manufacturers to adopt it.
It seems like there would still be an interest there for frame manufacturers to adopt it, though. Like the Shimanos and the Campagnolos and that of this world may be even more opposed this time around because they've seen the Trojan horse it was UDH. But for frame manufacturers, this could be another good thing, could it?
Yep, I think so. I think there's cost savings to be had here for frame manufacturers, just as UDH is actually a pretty simple design to manufacture in a sense, like it is a whole. So I think there's potential benefits here. I also think there's fear of brands saw what happened last time when they didn't adopt UDH, and there were some brands left out that couldn't really sell a mountain bike for a few years. And I think that's, I think just out of chance, I think a lot more people will adopt it this time around.
Yeah, I think my point was more like we're unlikely to see this getting ignored simply because we kind of got tricked the last time around. That would be cutting off your nose to spite your face.
Yeah, I think so. It remains to be seen. Like, this is obviously all the photos show it more as a mountain bike design. It remains to be seen how and why it would be applied for road. But given how many flat mount alignment issues we're seeing in the market, I mean, it might just be the solution we've been looking for.
Can I go on the record and just say it's ugly as sin?
Yes, you may.
Thank you.
How is it ugly?
So anyway, it's more watch this space, but the fact that they've had this patent approved, I think is maybe they'll never do anything with it, but it feels to me likely that they will do something with it.
Yeah, they have persisted that they've been working on it clearly for years now, based on the patent kind of filing dates and things. So hopefully we'll see it in real life one day. At least I want to see it. Ronan can just cover his eyes and not look at it.
It's just something about it all being outside the triangle. It just, anyway.
Yeah, I get it. It's like an aero bike. It's just... Okay, right. We're going to move on to our next topic, which is kind of what Ronan has been thinking about, what's going to happen in 2025.
Yes, what's on your mind, Ronan?
I have had some things on my mind for a few weeks that we haven't really had a chance to discuss. Sort of stemming from the Colnago Y1RS launch and related to performance road bikes. But I think 2024 was peak bike, and it's
Explain yourself.
For the general customer, for the paying customer, and for performance road bikes, as I said. The reason I think that is because with so much of that Colnago being dictated by what the team wanted, and the World Tour getting so competitive and aero becoming so important, I just see brands now being more and more justified in creating what are effectively prototype pro-only bikes, but because of the UCI rule, they have to be sold. And so while we will still be able to buy them, they're going to be more complicated, they're going to be more pro-specific, they're going to have things that maybe compromise our enjoyment of them, but enhance the pros' use of the bike. And as such, I think 2024 was a year where the industry even, had a greater understanding of aerodynamics than ever before. We were able to build it into lighter and better bikes than ever before. And going forward now, those bikes, they may well be better for the pros, but they might not be better for us, is kind of where I'm thinking we might see things go.
I'm not sure I entirely agree with you, just based on who are you envisioning as the customer that's missing out now?
Well, I think this gets to a point that maybe you and I both share, in that I think what actually ends up happening here is the people who are currently buying the wrong bike end up buying a bike that is much more wrong.
As in, they're currently buying a race bike when they shouldn't be buying a race bike, and they're going to buy the race bike that is now far worse for fit than it ever was. They're
going to buy the race bike that isn't even intended to be sold. It just has to be sold under the rules.
Gotcha.
See, I'm more hopeful. I'm hoping this is an example of the region beta paradox, where things get worse to the point where people are forced to make a better decision. So I hope that the newer breed of race bikes are unfit enough for the average rider that endurance bikes now become a legitimate consideration.
May I bring to your attention the price of bikes these days? As it has been getting worse, the sales have continued unabated of those expensive bikes. Yeah, I hope you're right, but I'm not.
Yeah. And I think like it's worth noting that like a lot of this running is also coincides with the return of the true aero bike, and I think we're starting to see some of these true aero bikes are really taking a pro in the approach to the geometry and the fit dimensions. I had a friend, Peter Arch, who's a mechanic in Melbourne, and he pointed out to me, he was asking my opinion, he pointed out to me the geometry of the new Ridley Noah Fast. He's like, am I reading this? Is there a mistake in this geometry chart? Because he's like, I can't remember what size he was looking at. I think it was a 52 or a 52 equivalent, or maybe it was a 54 equivalent. But it basically had the stack of like a 49 centimeter specialized, but the reach of like a 61 centimeter specialized. And it's like, yeah, what's going on here? I'm like, this is not the bike for you. So it's just
I think we've discussed the inherent flaw in that dropped head tube design previously on the podcast. But you're exactly on the point that I was thinking there in terms of while we previously had dedicated aero bikes, they were maybe aesthetically aero, whereas going forward, they're going to be true aero bikes with very little consideration for aesthetics, very little consideration for serviceability, even less consideration for serviceability than there previously was. If I think of that Colnago, for example, I mean, there's a BSA threaded bottom bracket in it, which will work, but works better if you're on Shimano. And if you're a SRAM customer, that may not be ideal, whereas there's not going to be a SRAM team using that bike. So that's maybe a bit of a stretch, but it kind of just, one of the things that had triggered this thought in my mind. But yeah, the geometry example is probably the best example there, in that I do think those extremely long and low geometries. We did a whole podcast on this over Christmas with Rob English, released a bonus episode there, so probably tune into that. I think the longer reach is something that is the direction that these bikes should definitely go in, but I think the stack should be much, much higher rather than much, much lower to enable an aero position. But that's maybe something we see again in the future.
How does this go together with the conversation that is going on now then with the racing safety and limiting speed and everything? If bikes are going to get just better and better for the racers, how's that going to work out?
Yeah, I mean, I see this two things. Like, there's some people in the peloton and associated with the peloton that are calling for us to, for some regulation around controlling the maximum speed of a cyclist, reducing the average speed of a cyclist for safety reasons. And yet, right now, we're in an arms race of brands trying to make riders as fast as possible. So yeah, I think we're going to hit a point where brands take it so far that the likes of the UCI step in and go, okay, now we're going to get rid of aero bikes, or it's gone too far. Let's price cap it. I don't know, Ronan. What do you think here?
I know that regulating the maximum depth of rims, introducing new bar widths, and regulating the maximum gear that a rider could have are on the table for the UCI. But in terms of actually, do we get to such a point with aero bikes that the UCI have to step in? There's a very big problem there for the UCI in terms of doing that. If we want to make racing slower, because we assume that'll make it safer, all the interventions we're talking about are sort of sticking plasters at best and really ineffective in most cases. What you actually need to do is just make the riders less aerodynamic. And so that would work if we said, right, you can't make these aero bikes. That would have an effect. The problem with that, though, is that you immediately remove the opportunity for bike brands to say this new bike is faster than the old one. And if they can't say that, it gets very difficult to sell new bikes if they're not faster.
Yeah.
If they're not better because we've determined that faster is better. And if they can no longer sell new bikes, there is no real value in them sponsoring World Tour teams anymore. And all of a sudden then you get to a point where the whole sport is in a very difficult place.
I thought we were getting into a more optimistic direction. No, we just got into a doom and gloom here again.
Yeah. No, and I think to Ronan's point, it's worth reminding people that like cycling brands remain the most stable income for racing. You know, like there are some big sponsors and outside of industry money in pro cycling, but time and time again we've seen that it's the bike brands that keep the teams afloat. So yeah, I think Ronan, your point is really interesting. It comes I saw something very similar to Dan Bingham, which is like your gearing restrictions are dumb. It's not going to slow down the peloton, but yeah, it's a rider drag issue. And I kind of jokingly trolled him a little bit with a comment saying that the answer is to set a maximum weight limit. That if we forced riders to ride a bike that was, say, no more than 5 kilograms, then all of a sudden, like, the whole arms race for pure aero bikes goes away. How much do you hate my idea, Ronan?
How much do I hate it? I wasn't, if I'm truly honest, Dave, I wasn't paying that much attention to it. So maybe that... Maybe that gives you an indication. I think it was at the maximum weight limit that you lost me somewhere there. But you kind of do get to one of the points that another point that Dan has in terms of he strongly believes that the minimum weight limit should be increased, and I tend to agree with him. The only reason I can't fully support that idea is because although it doesn't really matter, it does also matter if you take a Gaia Riolini, for example. The 6.8 weight for a current bike is already a considerable higher percentage of her body weight than, say, I'm going to take Tom Boonen because he's just the first 90 kilo rider I can think of, or close to it, or maybe a Magnus Backstead or something like that. But and yeah, whether that makes a huge difference or not is one thing, but it certainly is something I think we need to consider. It's just not as easy as increasing the weight limit. But if you did increase the weight limit, Dan's argument is, and an argument I strongly agree with, is that we could then look at ways of making bikes better, making bikes safer, integrating things that make the sport better for the fan to watch. So in terms of data transmission, in terms of analytics, in terms of GPS transponders so we know where riders are, in terms of G-force sensors so we know what a crash has been like. There's all sorts of improvements you could make if you said, okay, the weight limit is now 8 kilos. And one thing I had looked at before in another article was like, if we turned around and said, you know, the new UCI regulation is 8.5 kilos, and also actually you have to make them from more sustainable biofibers. Those are the kind of interventions that would be possible if the weight limit was increased. But why the weight limit is where it is, yeah, there's very little incentive for any of that to happen.
Yeah, I think yeah, the bikes would only get safer if it was like the weight limit has increased and you have to have these elements involved with the bike. I think if you just merely increase the weight limit, all that'll happen is bikes will get faster, in that they'll be more aerodynamically optimized than ever before. And rider drag will decrease and speeds will go up.
Yeah, the key thing is that you mandate, you know, the piece that I had written was you had to mandate, you know, that by such and such a date we have to use biofibers, you have to use bioresins, you have to do the other thing I come up with was like, you can only use this type of bottom bracket standard, you can only use this type of brake mount, you can only use this type of headset. And the UCI do actually have the power to do all of this. I mean, their frame approval process, they, you know, it literally just checks that it looks like what they think a bike should look like. But it's been so successful that the bikes using the Tour de France and pretty much all the bikes in the local bike shop, regardless of whether they're going to be raced or not, all go through the UCI frame approval process because of the commercialization rules. So it can be done. Dan's point then, which I agree with also, was like, if you add in all these other things that would improve engagement, improve safety, and mandate those as part of an increase in the weight limit, interventions like that are going to be much more effective than interventions like banning aero bikes or, you know, reducing or limiting the teeth count on a chain ring. Those things are going to be ineffective.
Sure. Yeah. Anyway, I guess one to watch. We'll see. This is almost a prediction, hey, in that whether we see these more pro-only bikes. We
could go into all the details as to why gearing restrictions won't slow the peloton down, but we did that in yesterday's Spin Cycle podcast. So go and listen to that if you want to know more details than that, because I've taken more time than I think you were going to give me for this segment.
Yeah, I think we're going to give a little bit of time to Alex, though, because I think we've talked a lot about road bikes and this scenario, but I think Alex had a good point in our notes about this kind of applying to other segments as well.
Yeah, I think we're just potentially at quite a delicate point where the all-road or endurance bike potentially has its best shot ever at becoming the popular choice for the consumer rider. I think if pro race bikes do become that little bit more niche and specialized to the point where, you know, people talk about the bikes becoming uncomfortable or unrideable, or they just simply can't get a fit that works for their body, they're going to have to look elsewhere and away from the bikes they see in the races. And I think that opens up the door for all-road and endurance bikes. And I don't think it's too dissimilar from what we saw in mountain biking over a decade ago now, when the enduro bike came into existence. The downhill bike became so niche that for most riders it just was no longer the right tool for the job. And as soon as the enduro bike came into existence, it kind of answered the prayers for the average rider that just goes out to ride for fun.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I kind of almost feel like we're starting to get back to the start of the circle with endurance bikes. Like I remember, what was it, 15 years ago, Specialized Roubaix, they actually put quite a bit of marketing behind it. They had Boonen riding them. They had, Trek de Mano had Cancellara on it, and both Trek and Specialized used to sell a ton of those bikes. Like the endurance bike was the best-selling bike in some markets. And at the same time, we had like the early Venge, and we had the early signs of the pure race bike, which were actually quite terrible to ride on regular roads and for regular punters. And who knows, maybe we're getting back there, but I don't know. I think there's also so many lessons learned that the latest race bikes, while they're still truly and honestly not the best thing for the average rider to be on, they're probably also still a pretty good time.
Yeah, and I'm going to give myself a selfless plug here, but if you want to read more about the potential of the all-road bike being a good choice for you, I have got an article up on the website already where I look into whether the all-road bike is the best bike for your next purchase.
Yeah, go and read that. It is a good read. This whole conversation makes me think about, I think Ronan has referred to motorsports a lot, and I just kind of think when there's a whole conversation whether we should be on the race bikes or not. But if you look at something like Formula One, I don't know, like I never desired to own a Formula One car and drive it. Like it just seems like absolute. Well, yeah, like even if it was a possibility, I would never want to. Like I'm like outside my capabilities. But then somehow in cycling, we just think like, no, we want the race bikes. Like maybe the division would be good.
There is also the argument that, you know, one of the beauties about the sport is you can ride the exact same bike that wins the Tour de France. I could make the argument for both directions.
Yeah.
It's a tough one. But you are right. You know, we look at the Ferrari Formula One car and we go, I would like a Ferrari road car. We don't look at it and go, how do I get myself one of those? And it is slightly different because they're prototype cars and all that, and there's only 2 of them made and you don't expect, but still, yeah, the point is valid.
Yeah.
And you would be in financial ruin if there was a pothole on the ground.
Yeah. I've never owned one, but I have driven the Formula One car.
It can maybe happen with the bike as well, as we touched with the prices.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that is what's been on all of our minds lately. We're going to move on to some quick tech bites next. Dave looks very happy to kick off because you've got loads to hear.
Every time you say that, I think of chicken nuggets. Tech bites.
Tech bites. Well, maybe we should rename this section into quick tech nuggets. Little nugs of wisdom.
Quick chicken bites.
Right. Right. We're going to start off with number 6 has a new adventure fork out.
Yeah. So, I mean, number 6 is the composites branch of number 22, the very luxurious titanium, custom titanium brand out of the US. So number 6 is their own brand that I guess they initially started to have their own fork with, and it's a brand of fork that you now see on a number of other makers. So Maru Cycles out of Australia is one that comes to mind as someone that uses their fork. But yeah, they've basically just announced that they're now going to be offering consumer sales of their forks, which is quite neat. So they've got a road fork, a road disc fork, they've got a gravel fork, and they've got a brand new adventure fork, which has clearance for 700 by 50 mil tires. It's got pannier mounts. It's got dyno routing. It just looks like a really good fork. It only comes in a 50 mil rake, but it looks well weighted. I think it's about 450 grams claimed with the full steerer. Not too crazily priced, like sort of a new competitor to Envy, I guess, in the scheme of things. But it's nice to see that brand go from being something that you kind of had to be making custom bikes in order to source, and now it's something that you can sort of just buy off the shelf for whatever frame you want. So yeah, it's good to see the choice.
Nice one. Okay, Ronan, there's a new sensor as well that you can tell us more about.
Yes, there is. Core, who make those core body temperature sensors, have announced that they're making like a second generation of that, the Core 2. I always find this very confusing because core sensor, core body temperature, there's a lot of core. And so it does get a bit confusing. But as of, I think, March this year, their second iteration of that sensor will be 48% smaller, 30% lighter. It was already pretty light, so but it is going to be lighter again. Just general updates to that. And then they've also designed like LED lights into it now that will indicate device connection, battery status, and that. But one thing that I thought was kind of nice about it is that the international pricing hasn't been determined yet. The device in Switzerland will cost 270 Swiss francs. This is a new version. But if you've got one of the existing core sensors, you can send it back and you'll get a discount on the new version. I don't have details on what that discount will be or anything, but at least there's something like that in place, which I thought was unique.
I mean, that's good for the consumer, but what happens to the old ones?
That is a very good question. I don't have the answer to.
Bin, maybe.
A part of me thinks that they want them back for some reason.
Yeah, maybe they'll upgrade them. Well, we'll investigate that. Speaking of LED lights, Garmin has a new heart rate monitor, and there's really not too much to say about it. It comes in 2 sizes, which is very exciting because I find the one size is always too big for me, so it keeps slipping down. So I think it was an extra small to small and medium large kind of chest length size, strap length size. And there's a LED status light on this monitor, on the little pod, and I believe that is the first for Garmin heart rate monitors.
Yeah, so the main thing is HRM 200. I think the main updates are actually more in the things that don't really matter to anyone, which is like privacy of data transfer and I believe security of the battery, because coin cell batteries now are quite well regulated throughout Europe as far as keeping them child safe. So I think there's a few things that Garmin's doing here that are largely based around like emerging data laws and battery security laws that they have to basically have to meet with new products they're selling. So I think that's sort of the big reasons behind this new product. But yeah, I think they're dare I say perhaps the first mover in a lot of this. But for this one, I'd point people towards DC Rainmaker if they want to know the specifics of that.
Ray had a whole article on the new regulations that could affect or will affect, but haven't yet happened, and plus going forward. He published that over the weekend, and Ray's obviously been on the show previously with us here, and that's well worth a read. Although reading through it seems like it won't directly impact devices we already have, but could impact devices going forward.
So Wolftooth has released a brand new headset. Dave, do you want to tell what is it compatible with?
New Wolftooth headset. It's a IS52, so it's sort of integrated standard 52mm, which is sort of the headset bearing size that pretty much most fully integrated bikes have adopted in recent time. And Wolftooth just have it to match Envy's in-route cockpit system. So you can sort of grab that new Envy system and match it with this like low stack Wolftooth headset that comes in a bunch of colors. So not really bringing anything truly new to the market here. I mean, Chris King already offer headsets of this kind, but yeah, nice to have options.
Nice. And last but not least, a bit of an industry news piece or a tech bite news piece? A bit of both, I guess.
It's certainly a bit of both. So yeah, there seems to be a little bit of upset in the industry. Scarab Cycles, it's a Colombian steel custom bike brand. They've been doing some really cool stuff, some wild paintwork as well. Yeah, they basically have run into an issue where Factor Cycles has released a new Ostro VAM in a Scarab edition, which has like a pretty cool paintwork, and they're using a Scarab logo that looks similar to Scarab Cycles logo, and Scarab Cycles is claiming that they've sent cease and desist letters, but Factor seems to be moving ahead with trying to sell these things. Alex?
Yeah, I do think given the paint scheme of this edition, and given that Scarab Cycles is kind of well known for the paint schemes they offer on their bikes, it does seem like a bit of a faux pas from Factor to go down the Scarab naming route. And in the letter that I've seen that Scarab has sent over to Factor, they do point out that the natural conclusion at the minute is that this is a collaboration, even though there is no collaboration between the two brands. So in this case, I definitely fall on the side of Scarab Cycles with how they feel.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, I don't think it's intentional on Factor Cycles' point, but I mean, Scarab is kind of big enough now. Like they've been at Made, they've been at a lot of these big international bike shows. They've had international press. I think they are big enough now for Factor sort of be aware of them and to, I guess, respect the fact that they have this name and they're known for their paint, and yeah, it is, as you say, Alex, it's Scarab's issue is that there's market confusion. There are people actively asking them, actively asking the company and assuming that there's a connection here, a partnership, and there just isn't. So anyway, one to watch. I think if we see Factor remove the Scarab naming from its paint, then I think Scarab Cycles has got its wish.
Yes. I was just Googling who Factor did. They did the collaboration with this skateboarder, and I thought maybe the skateboarder was a Colombian, but he wasn't. He's actually Nicaraguan. Anywho, side tangent. Yeah, I think considering how big of a brand Factor is, and with all the collaborations that they do, they must do some sort of research on like not just slapping on a name on a bike.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't work for them, but I would do.
I'm not sure Factor Ostro Beetle has quite the same ring.
Yeah, not quite.
Ladybird.
That'd be good. I think that's all the little tech nuggets that we had for this week. We're gonna next welcome Brad into the show because we're gonna get into the Ask a Wrench questions.
Hey Brad, how you doing?
Hey Dave, it's good to see you. I'm doing well. Yeah, I'm doing well to answer your question.
Where do we find you in the world today?
Today I'm in Washington D.C. again. Been bouncing around a lot, not as much as I'm going to be, but I have been 3 weeks away from home in Washington D.C. So I'm back down here, back in the shop with Greg this week at Precision Bicycle Services, and some of that's taking care of my own team-related business. Some of it's to help Greg out too. So we're going to try to knock it all out in a few days and see where we end up.
A lot going on. You were just telling me that you're not home to receive, 17 parcels from a drivetrain manufacturer?
17 parcels from SRAM, coming straight from Taiwan, so fresh off the assembly line. Yeah, it was...
No retail packaging involved.
No, it's a lot of unmarked things that have barcodes on them, and they're up to me to know the difference between them. So hopefully I still got it.
Yeah, wow. Okay. And what's the first race on the calendar for you?
The first race on the calendar is the Belgian Waffle Ride, BWR, in Arizona. So it's in Cave Creek, Arizona. It's going to be in 1st of March is race day. So I'll be heading out there last week of February. Probably a nice place to be in the last week of February compared to Washington, D.C. or Pennsylvania, where I spend most of my time these days.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, it sounds like a busy month ahead of a lot of bikes
Yeah,
to build, but
a lot to do.
yeah. Well, you're here. I'm here. We've got some questions. Let's jump in. We've got 3 questions to answer this week, so let's hear the first one from Allison of Longmont, Colorado.
I've been recently flummoxed trying to remove some cranks from a couple of bikes. One of them a SRAM bike, and one of them that had race face cranks. I managed to get them both off, but one of them required a trip to the bike shop, which was pretty frustrating. Meanwhile, bikes that I have that have Shimano cranks are held on with just a couple of pinch bolts, whereas the SRAM and race face cranks practically require an act of God to get them unscrewed and off of the bike. Can you talk about why the two systems are so far diverged? How can Shimano get away with just a couple of low torque pinch bolts where other crank makers need 50 Newton meters on a giant bolt? Thanks.
All right, Brad, this is a really good question. It's a question I've heard quite a few times over. I guess, yeah, before we answer the question itself, like, I think it's probably worth describing to listeners like what Allison's talking about here. Like, there are very different methods of attaching the crank. Can you sort of explain how Shimano does it versus how the likes of SRAM and Raceface do it?
Yes, and this is a good question, Allison. This is one I've asked sort of myself rhetorically a number of times as I've struggled with the same thing you are struggling with your SRAM cranks. Where to begin here? I feel like it, first of all, it has less to do with the torque value than it does with the design of the SRAM cranks that makes them difficult to remove. 50 Newton meters is not necessarily that outrageous of a torque value compared to other manufacturers, but I would say SRAM is unique in the amount of torque necessary or force required to actually turn the bolt the opposite direction when you want to loosen them up. And that's something Dave and I and the rest of us have discussed on this podcast a couple of times in the past few episodes or over the last several months. And so, Shimano's Holotech 2 design, the one you described in your question, where there's 2 pinch bolts that basically secure the left crank arm to the spindle, virtually unchanged, at least fundamentally unchanged since like 2000 and I want to say like 5 or 6, Dave. Maybe you.
I think it might be
maybe
like
4.
3 or 4,
3. Yeah. It's so a long time, and it's stood the test of time. And the way that it works, if you're unfamiliar, it's essentially the same premise as how your headset is preloaded and tightened with 2 pinch bolts on a stem, or sometimes 1, or occasionally 3, but usually 2 on the stem. And it's preload from the top with the top cap and a bolt, where you just gently kind of create enough compression that there's no wiggle room, let's call it, or looseness in the headset bearings themselves. You don't want to obviously over tighten it where the bearings bind. You're just essentially occupying the free space that exists as you tighten that preload. It's like a preload bolt, little bolt, kind of a plastic bolt that's on the left crank arm to gently contact the bearing shield on the left side and no further. And then you tighten those 2 pinch bolts to about 12 Newton meters, 12 to 14 is recommended. And it's that those 2 bolts that basically, secure things in place. And it's the preload is only used to occupy the lateral play that may exist and just to get rid of that. And obviously, if you've used the system before, it's quite easy to remove the left arm and subsequently the right one too. Because all you have to do is loosen those 2 bolts, basically back that preload bolt out, and then everything just kind of pulls apart. Very easy, very little force required. Meanwhile, SRAM has introduced, it's kind of been this way for even back in like the PF30 days. So it's been, a decade or so, at least, maybe more now, of having this very difficult, I would call it galling. Would you say it's galling, basically, is the correct term?
Yes.
Yeah, it's not really seizure of the threads, but it's actually like kind of friction and sticking between the underside of like the crank bolt itself and where it's bottomed out against the, it's kind of housed within the drive side arm. And
it's also like the stretching of the threads because they're lightweight material, so they're kind of like mechanically bonding in a sense through stretch.
Yes, it's like deforming from the tolerance that it's designed within, basically. And You can use anti-seize, you can use all types of grease. It doesn't really affect this too much if you're using kind of one of the higher end crank arms with an aluminum bolt.
Mm-hmm.
The only way that I've seen it really improved upon, there's two ways. One is you can replace that aluminum bolt with a steel one, small weight penalty, which is why the alloy version exists in the first place, is essentially just to shed a few grams from the system. But that definitely improves things. You can also disassemble the bolt assembly, take the self-extracting cap off and grease all the surfaces. And that kind of improves things for a short while until the grease is displaced, and then it kind of returns to the same.
Doesn't
problematic.
wholly solve the issue. It just reduces the stiction.
Reduces, slightly mitigates, I would say, but not fixes.
Just to rewind for a sec. So I mean, you explained the Shimano system, but I think it's worth probably explaining the SRAM / race face / other system with the single bolt, which is that the Shimano is basically using a straight spindle with that pinch bolt. As Brad said, it's basically like a steerer tube and threadless headset assembly. But other cranks that use a single bolt are using a tapered spline. So basically what that bolt's doing is pulling the crank arm onto a taper, which is effectively locking the crank in place, creating a really secure fit, and then that bolt sort of retains it in place. Shimano make up the difference in like bottom bracket widths and variances there with that preload bolt. These cranks take a different approach, normally either using like shims or wavy spring washers or like a little threaded collar that you then tighten down. Once the crank's secured, you then tighten down the system. So it's just different ways about going about it. Both have good and bad. Shimano cranks can fall off if misused and mistightened, and so can SRAM and the like also if that bolt comes loose. But generally speaking, once a crank is wedged onto its taper, it's less likely to wiggle undone, even if the bolt's not super tight. So, I mean, the idea is that the SRAM sort of crank is potentially more foolproof in terms of once it's on, and it won't come off. But I guess as the question points out, and as Brad, as you're answering, once it's on, it is really on. So
yeah, it's foolproof until you want to remove it, and then it's full of all types of excitement and sometimes creativity required to remove it.
So short of so putting grease or anti-seize underneath the bolt head, which requires removing that puller cap, is one method. Replacing the aluminium stock bolt with steel is a proven method that does greatly help here. Any other tips for undoing that other than just more leverage?
This is it's an effective solution, but you want to be a little bit careful depending on your frame and kind of how lightweight and delicate the left chainstay is. But an effective technique that I've used is to use like a toe strap or something very similar to that, like a ratchet strap, to basically anchor the left arm against the left chainstay of the frame. I usually wrap it around like 3 times to kind of distribute the load a little bit more broadly, so you're not putting all that force, kind of on one relatively narrow strip of a toe strap strapped to your chainstay. But I've never had any problem with this personally. I've never seen any frames damage doing this. But basically, to just kind of keep that left arm, I should back up by saying, when you're loosening it, you're also going to be rotating the cranks backwards as though you're backpedaling, because lefty loosey, that's also the direction of backpedaling your bike. So you have to fix the crank in place, and so this is why you're strapping it down. And if you do that with a long enough lever, I've in my toolbox that I carry when I travel, I have an Abbey Tools hammer, which has a hollow handle, and that functions pretty well as a kind of longer lever to put around the 8mm Allen wrench that's in the bolt itself. And with that, usually there's enough leverage without much difficulty, to actually break that bolt free. Once it's loose, it's no problem to remove it, but it's that kind of initial overcoming that galling we were discussing. Once it's free, it's usually pretty pretty easy to turn that bolt. Just that first moment is the difficult one.
Yeah. So leverage is definitely your helper here, and as Brad said, you want to the main difficulty is like securing that that arm to stop rotating, so you can put some weight behind the leverage. So another option is to like sit the bike and the left hand pedal on like a brick or a block of wood that stops it from rotating around. Then you can achieve much the same. You can also take the left pedal off and put like a pipe over the crank, and rest that pipe against the ground or hold it and then use a long lever. There is also a faithful old impact wrench, which I'd probably advise against using if a power meter is involved.
Yes.
But an impact wrench will often make pretty quick work and easy work of these. And lucky last, there's the inner tube method, which came from a mechanic in, I believe, in Korea, and it's something I've written about on Escape before. I think it's like how to remove a stuck crank with an inner tube, I think is probably how you'll find it on Google. But that is an option. You basically are creating this compressive force between the hex key and the pedal, and you're wrapping an inner tube forever, constricting it tighter and tighter until eventually it pops. And I've tried it. It does actually work. It's a bit slower than I like to do in the workshop, but if I was out on the road and all I had was a hex key, it's probably the method I'd be using. So there is in my threaded series, I do actually have an article dedicated to all things about removing stuck or tight bolts. So check out the threaded series. You'll find an article that basically details and explains each of these methods and the tools required. So anything else to add on that, or should we move on to the next one?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that in my experience, despite there being a few shared kind of similar approaches like you described among Race Face and FSA and some other ones maybe, it seems that SRAM is uniquely kind of the hard one to deal with. So some of it, I think, has to do with the materials used between the spindle and the bolt. But it is a good question. It's definitely something that you're not the only person who's been flummoxed, Allison, to use your word, by. And yeah, it's kind of one of those things that, I mean, I've personally mentioned it to SRAM directly, and I know I'm not the only one. So maybe someday they'll resolve this in a way that's kind of more straightforward. But for now, at least we have a few known solutions.
All right. The next question is from a familiar voice. Let's just hear it.
Hey, folks. Ronan here. Yeah, that Ronan. The Ronan who's also on the show. Yeah, I've got a question for Brad and Dave. I'm going to steal this spot to ask, have you any tips for removing stubborn, caked on, breaking up bar tape? I've just spent far too long trying to remove bar tape from a bike that was just applied maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, has been through winters, has been through turbo training sessions, and was just stuck to the bars. So every time I peeled back a little bit, it broke up, and it took far too long. Any tips to help it come off in one go?
All right, Brad. So Ronan's question is something that pretty much every bike shop mechanic has had to deal with, and I would say the problem has gotten worse with the growing popularity of indoor cycling.
Yes.
What do you do with people's manky, disgusting bar tape?
Put on gloves, step one. I can smell this question from here, but my question is, I have a question for Ronan, is what are you doing? Waiting 7 years to replace your bar tape? You know better than that, Ronan. Come on. I think a lot of these questions have prompted PSAs in the past, and this one's no different. I would say,
I dare say this isn't Ronan's bike to defend him. So
it's not.
But yeah,
I
think it's a friend of his. But yeah.
Well, if you're a friend of Ronan's, then I'll say the same thing to you as I'd say to him directly. But yeah, this is a good PSA. Bar tape doesn't always look like it needs to be replaced, but there's a lot going on under the tape that over time can develop into problems that you may not realize. Some of that is corrosion of an alloy bar. I've seen bars with holes worn, like eaten through them by corrosion, kind of a white, dusty, crusty, salty mess that kind of, once you soak through your bar tape, especially when you're riding your trainer, or if you ride in wet weather frequently, it kind of soaks through and it kind of doesn't evaporate quickly because it's sort of under there, not exposed to air much, and kind of, can form salt deposits, and especially around the band clamp and around the hoods, especially is where you see failures. I've seen bikes come into the shop where the drop part of the bar is completely detached and only held there by the tape itself. So let's use this also as a PSA. Replace your bar tape a little bit more often if you're one of those who's had a few years worth of riding on your bar tape. But
it's a PSA we've had before and one we needed to have again. So thank you.
Yes. And, but yes, any of my fellow mechanics out there who's untaped one of these handlebars, it's a pretty stinky, nasty time. So also for the, as a courtesy to your mechanic, if you're not your own mechanic, this is also a nice thing to do, is replace your bar tape every now and then. But if you haven't, and there are some tapes that kind of develop this symptom, I would say more rapidly. Anyway, my first recommendation would be to use either a hair dryer or like a heat gun on kind of a lower setting, especially if it's a carbon bar. That can oftentimes soften up even hardened, kind of crystallized, crusty adhesives, which some bar tapes have underneath them. Some don't have very strong adhesive, some have none. Those rarely are difficult to remove, but there are definitely a few brands out there that I've seen. Even recently, I mean, Silka tape, which recently won like Tour Magazine's Tape of the Year.
It's actually pretty difficult to remove. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, my suggestion to Tour Magazine is to include removal of the tape in your criteria for evaluating the tape, because I just untaped a bar that had been taped for 3 weeks because somebody wanted to change the bar. They were sort of experimenting with different handlebar shapes and dimensions. And I struggled in the same way that Ronan's describing here in his question. And it was only like a 3-week-old roll of tape that we put on at our shop not that long ago. And
I've experienced that myself. Yep.
Yes. And so it's not only time and sort of the petrified adhesive that makes it a challenge. It can just sometimes be too much stickiness relative to the material of the tape itself, which kind of pulls apart and disintegrates when you unwrap it, because the tape is stuck so much to the bar that the force required to untape it is like causes it to basically pull apart and leave the sticky part plus a big chunk of foam attached to the bar.
Yeah. So assuming this issue is largely based on the adhesive of the tapes. I mean, the heat is sort of a known way to undo adhesives. There are also special chemicals that you can get specifically that break down adhesives. I would say just be careful with them, because some of them can like remove decals and clear coat and other things if you're not careful with them. Some are a bit more safe to use, but yeah, there are certainly like glue removers or sticker removers that you'll find at your local hardware store or online. They can be an option too. And then otherwise, I'd just recommend probably like alcohol of some kind. Not gin or whiskey, but like isopropyl alcohol or something.
That can help, though. That can help as the mechanic.
Yeah, it can.
Especially if you have a an hour-long removal process. You might want some alcohol.
Yeah, but like isopropyl alcohol is a pretty safe solvent, but it's not exactly a strong solvent. So maybe something like a white spirit / in Australia we call that, I think it's methylated spirit. So something like that can also really help to break down that adhesive and make it easy to remove. But yeah, I think the heat is a really good place to start. And I think following on from Brad's point of view, if you peel it back and there's a whole lot of like white corrosion-y dust everywhere, often you'll see mechanics using like a flat blade screwdriver to like chip that off and make a real mess, and it's real disgusting. I would say if you come across any pitting at all in the handlebar, this is going to be in an aluminium or maybe a steel handlebar, any pitting at all, like any sort of like grooves or little divots caused by that corrosion, it's time for a new handlebar. It's just not worth taking that risk. That bar's compromised at that point. This is a benefit of carbon, is that it won't quite have that same level of risk. I have seen issues with like paint corrosion and all that on carbon, but for the most part, this is one area where carbon is better. So,
before I knew this wasn't Ronan's bike, I was just going to tell him to get a new handlebar. That's my answer. But since it's not Ronan's bike, apparently, we'll start with a few methods that we've described first before pulling the trigger in our new bar.
Yeah, but some bar tapes are better than others, and I think prevention is always the best answer, regardless of what the topic is. And I think prevention here is, as Brad said, replace your bar tape more often, and also perhaps consider using a bar tape that doesn't have like a double-sided tape that holds it in place. I think bar tapes that have like a gel backing to them are superior in this regard. I don't know. Do you agree on that one, or do you have differing opinion?
I agree. I really don't like bar tape that has a sticky back.
Mm-hmm.
At least not like a significantly strong sticky back like that. we've had some discussions of my bar tape preferences in the past, which have been mixed review from the other hosts. But I like lightweight bar tape. I think that bar tape can, the way that it's installed, your method, like your technique is oftentimes what can or might not keep it in place. There are some methods around like the bends of the bar, like up on the tops where it kind of to the hoods where there's, where you might rest your palms and sort of stretch it out over time, where maybe like if you have like a row of tape where you've 180'd the electrical tape, if you're using some electrical tape, and kind of like roll it with the adhesive side facing up.
I just use double-sided tape, but yeah.
Double-sided tape is also effective there. Yeah, if you don't have that, some people don't. Sometimes you're out in the world without it, and you have to get creative. If you put like one revolution of tape side down, and then like flip it 180 so the tape side's up, you can kind of like 5 or 6 revolutions around that bend, and then flip it at 180 again to tape it down at the other end of that little section. That's oftentimes enough to keep that troublesome spot from slipping and sliding from your weight on your palms in that spot if you like to perch there, which some people do. And it's a very kind of low adhesive, but still adhesive enough method to kind of keep things from shifting around too much. So that's like one little tip. But generally speaking, if with the right tension and the right tape, I don't think that you really need that much adhesive underneath the tape.
Yep.
Anyway, so that's kind of why I don't know, thumb my nose a little bit of the Silka tape. It feels good, but I can believe it when we untaped that new bar. I mean, it's crazy.
It's not unique to Silka, the issue. But
no, it's not.
It is definitely a modern example. Just before we move on, just one other thing, because Ronan was asking like how to keep it in a single piece when removing it. I think your mention of the word tension there sprung something to mind, which is you can kind of feel the adhesive breaking free if you kind of keep the tension on the tape as you're undoing it, and keep your fingers really close to the tape. There is a chance that you can sort of keep it all together, and basically like you're using the tape to help pull off the adhesive as you go, but it can be slow going, and often it can just be quicker just to tear it all apart and then try remove the little bits afterwards. But
right.
Anyway, let's move on. Let's get to the next question.
Okay.
This one comes from Chris in London. All right. Let's hear from Chris.
I'm awaiting a new gravel bike frame, a Steyr Grodinger, so shout out to Sam and Judith at Steyr Cycles. It'll have a T47 bottom bracket shell, and I use a 24mm axle rotor crankset. So, which bottom bracket do you recommend from a longevity and easy servicing point of view? Is Chris King worth the cash? Are all the bougie enduro bearing equipped models much of a muchness? Looking forward to hearing your thoughts and then referencing Dave's article for what tools I'll need. Thank you.
All right, Brad. So looking into the Steyr bike, it looks like they use a T47 68mm shell, which means it basically uses a bottom bracket with the bearings on the outside of the frame shell. Yeah, I mean, any tips here?
Yes, some tips. First of all, there's a few questions asked within the question. I would say there's 2 approaches here. Chris King, is it worth the cash? Probably. There's some other good. I mean, probably. It depends. That's why there's 2. I would answer it I would answer it with 2 answers.
Sure, go on.
So, like, kind of the more economical approach, I would say, why not just stick with like a rotor bottom bracket? They make very nice bottom brackets themselves. They do offer a ceramic version and also a steel bearing version. The steel bearing version is very good and very affordable, relatively speaking, compared to some of the options that you...
And runs on enduro bearings that are referenced. Yep.
Yes. And they're just fine. And, they'll last a long time. There's no real express downside to really point out. There are some fancier bottom brackets out there, some that appear to spin more kind of smoothly or freely. Although I will say that a lot of that spinning that you see, kind of looks really appealing, is achieved through low contact bearing seals, not necessarily through anything that has to do with like actual quality. It is nice. There is some measurable, although slight, measurable gains to a bottom bracket that spins very freely like that. Like ceramic speed, you'll see them spinning like 30 times compared to like 3 for a very sealed bottom bracket when you just kind of turn the pedals without a chain attached, and it looks really amazing. But like I said, most of that's done through low viscosity grease and low contact bearing seals. The downside to those is that they frequently, I would say they require more frequent maintenance or more frequent cleaning and re-greasing in order to preserve them and prevent dirt and grit from entering, which it can more easily because the bearing seals are less robust and they don't keep as much out, but they also create less friction from drag, and so they spin nicely. So it kind of depends on your goals. If you want to have a bike that you don't have to fuss with too much, and you don't want to spend a fortune, you'd have great results with just a simple kind of matching rotor BB to go with your crankset. But if you want to spend some money and have something that saves you 3 watts or 5 watts, and
I don't think it's that much, but yeah,
it maybe not. Yeah, maybe not even that much. Maybe 1 watt. Yeah. Exactly. So that's kind of like the trade-off. And for a $400 bottom bracket versus a $45 or $50 bottom bracket, that's something that you can decide for yourself if it's worth it or not. But the bougie ones are nice, and they will last a long time if they're very well maintained and you frequently do clean them and do re-grease them. But if you do not do that and you just kind of run it, the low contact seals of those types of BBs will actually lead to kind of self-destruction of the bearings inside. So it's kind of up to you, but it's not. I mean, I've had great luck with Ceramic Speed, for example, is the ones I've used that are kind of the fancy high-end ones. We've had those as a team sponsor in the past, and obviously we do service them regularly, and they've lasted for like an entire season without ever replacing. So it kind of depends.
So my thoughts on this are that if you look at, say, bottom brackets from Rotor, Wheels Manufacturing, there's a lot of others. A lot of them are using very similar basic steel bearings, and they all work pretty well. Like, it's a machined bottom bracket cup with a bearing inside. Personally, I quite like them. They're cost effective. You can often get them in different colors. They're easy to work with. And the main thing is when the bearings die, you can just replace the bearings. Like, you don't have to replace that whole bottom bracket. So they actually are quite an affordable bottom bracket to use. The reason I would say to potentially consider avoiding, say, a Rotor or a Wheels Manufacturing is often they place the steel bearing race directly onto your crank spindle. And there is nothing sort of protecting, there's no barrier between the two, and that you will potentially get corrosion, some creaking in between those two surfaces. It can happen. And that's where, say, Ceramic Speed or even Shimano, and now SRAM with Dub, they actually put like a plastic top hat spacer between the crank arm and that bearing, and it gives you like this non-corrosive surface, non-marring surface for the crank to sit on. And in my experience, you sort of do tend to get like a slightly less prone to creaking, less chance of damage in the long term if you do neglect it. And I think that's a feature to look for. You can get that feature in cheaper bottom brackets, but in my experience, the likes of like Ceramic Speed do that top hat really well, where it's nicely sized, where you can still remove it by your hand and get behind that into that bearing for servicing without breaking anything, but it's tight enough that it doesn't let a whole lot of dirt in. And I think that's the reason to get Ceramic Speed, is that you can still service them. As Brad says, most of the speed gains in those bearings are just simply from the grease and seals, but I think they are an easy bottom bracket to service, and they're well proven for durability if you do keep up with the service. You often hear of cyclocross races being able to get multiple seasons out of one of those versus like needing to replace more standard, say, enduro bearings quite often. Same goes for like an Enduro XD15 ceramic bottom bracket. Like, I've heard those will go for years and years and years just because the bearings are so incredibly hard. They'll basically pulverize any grit that gets into them. But it's a question of, do you spend 10 times the amount on a bottom bracket up front, or do you use 10 sets of bearings?
10 bottom brackets.
Yeah. So yeah. It's going to be up to you what you want to spend. Chris King, amazing. I think there is great value in them if you service them, as Brad says. They do actually require quite a bit of servicing. It's not a product you can just neglect and expect to last you a lifetime. It'll only last you a lifetime if with regular servicing. My main point on Chris King, and I mean, this is no slight to Chris King because I love their products and their ethos as a company, but the main reason to get their bottom bracket is to match your headset and your hubs if you have Chris King headset and hubs. I think if it's the only Chris King part you had on a bike, I don't know if the bottom bracket is where I'd begin. I think there's other options out there that are potentially cheaper or just simply easier to service. So, anyway, food for thought on that one.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that part about the plastic top hat, as it were, the sleeve. That's a important thing to note as well, just in general. Yeah. And on the topic of Shimano Holotech 2 BBs, that's been something they've been doing since we agreed it was maybe 2003 or 4 on theirs, which is kind of a similar design to the types of BBs we're talking about here with your rotor, which is also a 24 millimeter spindle. So, and on my personal bikes, I run ceramic speed. I'm obviously comfortable servicing them, but I've had multiple bikes that I've swapped the same BB from one to the next until I get to far enough down the pike where they've changed the standards and I can't anymore. But they basically last, forever if you take care of them properly. So in that sense, that they are worth it. Yeah. Well, they are 10 times the price of a normal one. So it's like who knows?
Yeah. So I mean, on my own personal bikes, I've got, I don't think I do at the moment, but I previously had 2 bikes with the same bottom 68 mil T47 bottom bracket shell. On one bike, I had a rotor bottom bracket with steel bearings. On the other, I had the ceramic speed. The ceramic speed did noticeably spin better. The rotor had noticeably more aggressive sealing to it. Never had a problem with either one. So like it's just, but yeah, it goes back to the rotor did have direct contact of the bearing races to the crank spindle, and based on that, I think I preferred the ceramic speed on 1, how it spun, 2, knowing the bearings would last longer, and 3, that plastic divider. So consider it.
Dave, I had a thought, and this is not a thought for you, but it's a thought for ceramic speed and similar brands. What if they just made 2 versions of a bearing seal? Wouldn't that be something?
I think they do.
A high contact and a low contact. I
actually think they do. I know for sure Seabear and Kogel have both.
Yeah, but I hate Kogel.
Sorry.
Sorry.
That was quite a strong wording. I
don't love them.
Yeah, okay.
I wouldn't buy one.
They're not, truthfully, like Kogel, in my experience, is not to the same quality level as a ceramic speed.
Right. That's why. That's what I mean. That's what I meant by hate. Yes.
Yeah. So those brands do offer like cross seals versus like summer seals, light contact versus heavier contact.
There you go.
I actually don't know off the top of my head about ceramic speed, but I think they do. I think the mountain bike bottom brackets come with like the heavier duty seal, and the road bottom brackets come with, like the ceramic speed X. I think I haven't gotten one since the X brand
debuted. Actually, it's been a couple of seasons since I've. Yes. Okay.
Mike Garrigan from Ceramic Speed X, I'm sure he's listening.
I'm sure he
correct
is.
us if
hey,
needed,
Mike,
but
let us know. Yeah, and if not, get on that right away, please. Yeah. Thanks.
Cool. All right. Well, there you go. Bottom brackets. Lots of choices. Pick the color you like. Look for one with a plastic divider for the bearing, and away you go. And for this week, before we wrap up, I just wanted to give a little shout out to Ron from Minnesota. Ron, you submitted a great question about changing a gravel bike's handling, perhaps like through a different fork or various other options. But the voice clip you submitted is not usable. Please resubmit your question if you can. Thank you, Ron. Yeah, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, hey, I've got a question I'd like these geeks to answer for me, then please, would love you to submit it. You do have to be a member of Escape Collective, but at that point, then head to escapecollective.com/hello. Introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, and then ask your question. Try to keep it brief, around a minute is great, but and let us know the bike. But we'll happily get around to your question as soon as we can. All right, Brad, good chatting.
Good chatting with you, Dave. I love these moments, and I love the sort of thought-provoking nature of these questions. Sometimes they're questions I haven't thought of myself before, and sometimes they're things I've dealt with for the past 30 years and have nothing but thoughts about. So in any case, we had a little bit of both this week, so I'm happy to have gotten to participate. Thanks.
Nice. I'll speak to you next week.
That is all from us this week in terms of tech content. But before we leave you, we have some more content on our website to share with you. So, Dave, what have you read this week from us in the tech team that you would recommend others go and read?
The main one that comes to mind for me is Ronan's recent, recently published but not recently recorded interview with Rob English. So yeah, he really delved into talking about where race bike geometry may be headed, and I found that a really interesting conversation. So that was a bonus episode of Geek Warning, and you can listen to about 20 minutes of it if you're on the free feed. But it's a good one to listen to.
Recorded during the Giro and published during Christmas.
Yeah, there was a nice mention to what did he say at some point about, when I was watching the Giro like yesterday or something. I was like, what?
There was a couple of other things that gave it away that he wasn't just watching a rerun over Christmas either. Yeah.
You kept referencing your Nathan Haas interview from 2 weeks ago, which I think published back in June. So anyway,
I don't know if I need to explain why that happened, but it was
flies.
nothing to do with Rob. It was just me and not being happy with my work. But there we go.
Yeah,
it was a good interview. So
definitely. Ronan, has there been anything for you?
I liked Alex has Who's Riding What in the 2025 World Tour. And those articles are just, this time of year there's so much change. It takes Tour Down Under isn't really a race, it's more like a familiarization with the this year's peloton.
That piece is still keeping me busy.
Yeah. So I'm sure there's more to come there, but it's a resource, I would say, rather than just a piece to read.
Yeah, and related to that, we got that out the door at the start of the season, but we're next week I'm heading to Tour Down Under to photograph the bikes in person. So yeah, certainly keep an eye out for that, and we'll have all sorts of content coming from that race about who's riding what and what's new and all the intricacies of the new paints and any new bikes if they exist. But yeah, Alex, anything that's you've been reading, watching?
I think given the weather that I'm experiencing at the minute, where it's lucky if it gets above 0 degrees in the daytime, Suvi's piece on indoor training is very topical right now and shines some light on where we could see that space going in the years to come. So if you haven't read that, check it out.
There for my hope, there was some significant optimism by some of the people you interviewed, Suvi. One of which I can't remember, was he from My Whoosh, had claimed that his dream is for indoor cycling to become better than outdoor, and from my hope, I hope he is proven wrong. But it was
that is very optimistic.
Yeah, but yeah, there was definitely some interesting insight into that article, and it's pretty wild space at how competitive that space is at the moment, as your article outlined.
Suvi, did you have a favorite?
This is going to come a full circle. We're going to recommend each other's articles because that are there. There's over the holidays, we did publish some content from the past, and there's the best portable electric tire inflators piece from Dave, and I truly enjoyed that one. And yeah, it was one of the ones that I think it was very long and detailed, as most of your articles are. But yeah, it was just good. There's graphs, there's everything that you might want, and it was one that I actually was, at the time when it was published, I was considering getting one of these. So it was hugely helpful. And in the winter, I think easy to have one of these instead of anything else with you.
I'm glad you mentioned that one, Suvi, because I didn't have one of these when that was originally published, and when it was published again over Christmas, in the time in between, a mate had gifted me one, and it's not one that was on the list. So I'm looking forward to comparing it, because Dave had handily listed the weight, the dimensions, the size category, the price, the time to inflate to 80 psi to 25 psi. It had so much detail in there. I can very easily compare this to other options without having to do all of the comparisons myself.
Yep.
That's the beauty of it. This is kind of also, for me as a journalist, this works as my base when I'm now doing my group tests. So Dave, props for that.
Oh, thank you. I like causing others more work.
Yeah. Okay, with that, we're going to close this show, and next week, we're going to get maybe some Tour Down Under feels from Dave, and talk about more tech things. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.